Hello again for summer 2019 classes. This is Chapter 6 on Public Opinion. This is the beginning of our second set of chapters that we'll have for our midterm exams. So Exam 1 will be from Chapters 1 through 5. Then we'll have Exam 2, which will be from Chapters 6 through 10. And then we'll have our third midterm exam, which is Chapters 11 through 15. And that will then add up to the final that we'll have culminate with the final. And the last day of class, or perhaps also might allow for some time on that Wednesday before the last day to open up and have an opportunity to take the final, which will be comprehensive and will cover the first 15 chapters of the text, comprehensive in the sense of all the chapters that we've covered. So again, here we are with the beginning of our second set of chapters, Chapter 6, Public Opinion. And there's two main themes with Chapter 6, dealing with opinion and how our opinions are formed and how our opinions are measured. So how we develop our opinions, political socialization, and then looking at statistics and polling on how our opinions are measured. And we can see that through the use of measuring opinions, we're able to determine that there is conflict on the issue of how people perceive events based on their ethnic background and racial background. So this is from page 219 in your text, and you can see here a considerable difference between the black and white communities on the issues of how they are treated. So I would urge you to spend some time looking over page 219, not so much to prepare you for an exam, but just for you to understand the differences in our society. And so here we can see on public opinion polls on page 237, we have the definition of public opinion polls and scientific instruments for measuring public opinion. And notice, though, that one of the ways of looking at this is it's a snapshot of the public at that moment. So when you're taking a public opinion poll, when someone has taken a public opinion poll, it is looking at how the public is perceiving a particular event or person at that time, and that may change. More than likely will change. So here we're going back 4 years, but in the summer of 2015, notice the differences there when this poll was conducted. And the individual who went on to become president, Donald Trump, wasn't even on the list. And so we can see that there was a vast difference in the Democratic Party. We'll be covering political parties and on Chapter 9 in our text. So notice here that this is still a whole year before the election. So in fall 2015, once Donald Trump got into the campaign, really turned things around very quickly. So we can see there after the debates in that year before the election in 2015 made a significant difference there for his support. And again, taking a snapshot. We see some somewhat closing of the gap, still a year out before the election. And so here you're looking at roughly 5 months before the election. And then roughly a month before the election. Now, do keep in mind when we talk about the Electoral College, and we'll go into more detail about this, in many ways the national polling in 2016 was actually pretty accurate. But it was not that accurate from a state-by-state basis in terms of predicting who would win the election. But in terms of the outcome of the popular vote, it was pretty accurate. But the last two presidential elections, there's been some significant polling operations that have not been correct. And so here, I'm just sharing this with you. If you're interested, you can look this over, perhaps copy this screen, and consider what has worked and what hasn't worked in recent polling. Gallup, of course, it's probably a familiar name, I would think, for many of you, is a well-known polling firm, and it's used in all kinds of operations, and had predicted that Mitt Romney would receive more of the popular vote than Barack Obama in President Obama's re-election. So that was one of, in recent times, one of the significant polling firms that was just not accurate. And so one of the big issues that we can see here is the continued use of residential phone directories or using landline phones, and increasingly that's being phased out, and we'll probably end up with much more accurate polling to rely more on the cell phone than the landline phone. And I think all of us can fully understand that that would make more sense to go that direction. And here we can see in 2016, first off, you can not necessarily say that the polls were wrong, but to say the polls were predicting that it would be a considerable upset if candidate Trump was to be elected president. And so here you can see one of the better known firms or blogs that deals with polling, and that's a site that I would strongly urge you to review, called 538. And as you can see here, was giving candidate Trump very little chance of winning. But there are groups that were underrepresented in the polling. So your text refers to that as a selection bias. And so whites without college degrees turned out in higher numbers than what was expected and gave a larger percentage of their vote to Trump over Clinton. And so this is a source from Atlantic Magazine, something you can, I would imagine, find online if you'd like to read it. We also have this magazine in our library. So again, relying upon landline phones, just not an accurate way to do it. State polling, and again, after all, in the Electoral College, you can have a national poll, but there also needs to be state-by-state polling. And I actually had a student in my class that referenced to me the day of the election for me to look at state polling over the national polling, and showing that there was, in fact, lots of indication that this was going to be a very close election. And that's, again, there were plenty of polls that were showing that, but there was a major discrepancy between state polling and national polling. And again, considering the use of the Electoral College versus the popular vote leads to some differences there as well. All of this is really just for your general information to know about. We use polling, but in two recent major events, presidential elections, some important polling firms have not been that accurate. We'll come back to polling. Here we're looking at how we learn about politics, and every one of us continues to go through that process. So on page 216, you see a description of political socialization. You are going through that process right now in your life, as I am. It's not just that you go through political socialization by taking an American government class. By living your life, you go through political socialization. And you have different agents that impact your views of political socialization. So most of you are now in a time of your life in which you're seeing a major transition. You may not even fully be aware of it, But you're now seeing where your friends become a greater impact on your outlook of the world, your philosophies, your culture, and your politics. And so you were, throughout a good period of your life, having your parents having that influence on, and they still have influence on you, of course. But increasingly, you're spending more time and you're connected with other people than your parents, your friends. And this is where it becomes extremely important to decide for you individually who are your friends and who you decide to spend your time with, because they are going to shape who you are. And so I think it's very important to take that into consideration. Think about that transition that's happening in your life. When you get to be about 16 years of age, up until 25, and perhaps even more than that, this is really a time in which friends start to really shape your life and shape your politics as well. So up until that age, roughly again 16, 17, it's been the family that's had the most impact. So if you were, in most cases, if you were to ask a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old about politics, they're primarily going to be repeating what their parents have said, what they've heard their parents say. And so we can see here how important it can be on what type of family people may be from. And so if you're from a family that's very active in politics, then that more than likely is going to cause the child to be active, or at least someone who's interested, reads a magazine, reads a newspaper, follows some particular blogs online. That's going to have an impact on the child as well. If you're from a family where none of that really happens, then that can also have an impact on the child. And we do see that, parenting doesn't go away simply because the two-parent household has changed. But it does mean that the parents who are the elders who are having an impact on children can be different. Perhaps it's a grandparent, perhaps it's a neighbor, perhaps it's then someone on television that may be having that influence. As you see a decline perhaps, we do clearly in the numbers see a decline in the number of two-parent households. So that will change in some ways the influence of the family. And clearly we can see how the media changes and shapes our viewpoints about politics, what you're choosing to watch. And we're increasingly in a world of more of a smorgasbord or buffet type of news, right? Where you pick and choose what you want to read. This becomes incredibly important because you can end up then just watching or reading material that doesn't really stretch your horizons and make you think differently than what you've accepted throughout your life. And so it's like going to a cafeteria and you love macaroni and cheese, and so that's all you eat is macaroni and cheese. Well, maybe you need some spinach, and maybe you need something else there. And the old style of the media was, there's the media, there's the information, right? It's given right to you, like going to a restaurant and they have one thing on the menu and that's what you eat. So there's a lot of benefits of being able to choose, but it also then raises questions on what if you consistently choose the same thing, right? And what information are you not exposing yourself to in that process? But it's clearly a very important agent of socialization, the media. Religion is also a very important agent of socialization. Even if people are not active in a particular church, they're going to be around people who are. We can clearly see that culturally, religion has a huge impact on our society. Our holidays are centered around Christian events and holidays. And so it does have an impact. And what churches talk about or don't talk about is going to have an influence on how people are shaped and their viewpoints on politics. And schools may certainly focus on certain aspects of our culture and our history, and maybe in the process they're wanting to just get students to understand particular events but by focusing on those events, they are also shaping our politics. If you tell the story to third graders that George Washington never told a lie, you may feel as a teacher or people who are putting that together that that's an important story to know about one of the early leaders of our country. And maybe it makes young people inspired to be good citizens. But it also helps to shape the culture to say, well, you know, the leader of our country was a very honest person. And so it's going to attempt in some ways to shape our politics as well. And again, as we talked about, your friends or your peers, the people you're around, certainly when you're in school, you're around people that are not necessarily your friends, but you're around them. And by being part of that larger group, it's going to have an impact on your politics. And this leads to a challenge for any one of us. What if the group that you're part of, whether you're not necessarily, wanting to be part of that group socially, but you want to be part of that activity. You're on a sports team, you're in the band, you're in a play. What if there's an activity that's going on among that group, or there's some sort of communication that's going on that you find to be offensive and that you think is demeaning of somebody else? Would you be willing to step forward and say that type of language needs to change, or that type of behavior needs to change? Most of us don't really do that, but when it comes to the importance of actually making changes in our society, that's how it's done, and that becomes extremely important for individuals, and it is at that individual level, for individuals to be change agents. And here we can see from the sociologist and anthropologist Margaret Mead that this is how things get done. It's a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens. Change the world. Somebody just standing up and saying, that's not right, and moving on from there. There is a long culture in our history, a long continuous process in our history of having two political parties. And I would imagine many of us here have an idea that this is just part of the system. It's part of the Constitution to have two political parties. Well, none of that's in the Constitution. And most democracies around the world have more than two active and successful political parties, but not in the United States. And we're known for not only having just two political parties, but having the same two for a very long period of time. These two political parties, Democratic Party, Republican Party, have been competing with one another really going back to the 1850s. And the Democratic Party has been around in some form even back to the time of Jefferson in the 1790s. So very old, lots of competition between the two, changes with both parties. And it means that people may have really kind of a personal and cultural identity with one political party, even though it may not necessarily have that same connection to their individual political outlook, but they're still going to be impacted by that political party. Now, this is an interesting issue here that, and this may be changing, I should point that out to you, but I'll just share this with you, some of the issues raised about, from the University of Minnesota has done some consistent polling on the issue of atheism and how people view this particular group, which is a minority in our society. And when you look at religion, one of the ways that you can look at it is on the viewpoint of religiosity, which I think is extremely important, that not everyone who is a believer in a religion is a believer in the same degree. But even people who are not really that active in a religion tend to support religion over those with no religion. But again, I do want to emphasize that that may be changing. I don't really share the polling here, but there are some indications out there, and you might Google and look this up if you are interested, that there are some changes occurring on that viewpoint about religion or atheism. So this is an extensive screen here in terms of the verbiage, but 2,000 households, and from the University of Minnesota, and atheist was below all these other groups in terms of sharing their vision of American society. And they were not a group that they would want their children to marry, people in that group. So there you can see some resistance in that area, which of course for our sake here in American government class means that people who have that kind of viewpoint, and if they're running for office, are more than likely not going to share that viewpoint. They're not going to be that vocal about it. And so really kind of sum it up, Huffington Post, which is a website you might be interested in looking over as well. Philandering, pot-smoking president is still more popular than an atheist one. That seemed, of course, that's a little dated now, but not a lot of support there for that particular viewpoint. All right, so all of that was an important part of your area of the text, and I do have in the outline some page numbers that you can see, but certainly as you read through the chapter, you'll get some information on political socialization. Here's back to the issue of measuring public opinion. A sample is taken, so understandably not the whole population can be surveyed. So you survey a sample, you ask questions of a sample, and they have 3 keys to making sure that that survey will be successful. The sample, a lot of it has to do with the status of that sample, as we can see. Must be random, must have an accurate size, and must reflect the diversity of the population. There's other kinds of polling, so tracking polls. One of these 3, push poll, is found in your text. So the other 2 are not on your text. So tracking polls measure trends. A tracking poll would be a poll in which it's conducted for several days in a row. And that's, of course, time consuming and can be expensive as well when you have to hire people to make the calls and ask the questions. But let's say that you're wanting to see the status of 2 candidates running for office, and you measure on a daily basis their relationships with one another, in terms of the polling, in 2 weeks' time. So let's say, Monday, June the 14th, going on to the next, to Monday, June the 28th, and every day in between, you conduct a poll. And so you're wanting to see if there's a trend. On any one particular day, it may actually be less accurate than other polling. But if after 14 days you've consistently been able to see or detect that one candidate is at least 5 to 7 percentage points ahead of the other candidate, then you have a good idea that that candidate is ahead. So that's looking at tracking polls. You can also use tracking polls to determine the success of a particular advertising strategy, and maybe a product is introduced to the consumer and they now have a new type of advertisement, and so the company would like to see a month after that advertisement started how the public is viewing that new product, and so have this daily tracking of that success of that product and how people identify it or use it. Push polls, campaign technique mentioned in your text. We'll kind of go into some more detail about that briefly. it's not a poll, it's a negative campaign, and your text does an excellent job describing what it's all about, so certainly read that. Exit polls, just as we can see, there's a lot of controversy about it, but this is a way of knowing who voted for a particular candidate and why. And so you ask questions for the voters after they voted. Now, where it becomes controversial is if those the answers to those questions are immediately published. And then it becomes a controversial issue because you may now have some description of the voting trends before all the polls are closed, and does that influence how other people may vote? There's some indication that it really doesn't have much impact, but perhaps in some cases it does. For some individual voters. And so, should there not be any publication about how voters have voted according to an exit poll in one state while there are polls still open in an election? And I think we can see some reasons why they should not be publishing that. I mean, for one thing, it's not necessarily the case that all voters of all candidates are as likely to communicate to a pollster as everybody else, and so that's how it could be inaccurate. But this is helpful because it does let people know if there's some particular trends or indicators of who's likely to vote for what candidate. So if one particular candidate in the exit polls is getting 60 or 70% of the support from people in the ages of 18 to 25, because they're asked in the polling what is their age, then we can see how that can become a very important indicator and an important piece of information to know about the differences with the candidates and what group of people was supporting one candidate over another. So on page 245, you'll see this about the push poll used to spread disinformation. It can be an ugly business to look at campaigns and look at politics in general. And so focus on how a push poll is used. This is a movie that came out really over close to 50 years ago now. It's really phenomenal that it's that old of a movie, but it's still extremely worthwhile to look at what should a candidate be willing to do in order to win an election? Are there certain barriers that a person should not cross in that process of trying to win? And that's part of the emotional and moral conundrum that this candidate finds himself in, and that whole question about what to do in order to win. So the movie is called The Candidate, and I'm pretty sure it's available on YouTube if you'd like to watch it. So we do see that there are differences in our society. There's a great page in your text that goes into considerable detail about these differences. I would urge you to focus on that. And so do we have differences based upon our economic status and our political status in that case? On page 231. And clearly, income inequality is a major issue in our society, and we see a considerable separation that continues in our country. So focus on that and those page numbers. You also see here some of the differences in terms of ideology. So read over that on pages 212 and 213 and on over to page 214 in your text. And that's what we have here for Chapter 6. We'll be moving on then to Chapter 7 in the media and our next recorded lecture. And this is just one other way to sum up the importance there of having political knowledge and political efficacy. Just one more time, bringing that up to your attention. And perhaps that does, in fact, transcend everything else that we've covered in terms of our identities, our race, our ethnicity, our religion, our age, our income. It's political knowledge. And that's something that any one of us at any time in our life can at least seek by reading and learning from other people. All right, we'll be moving on now to Chapter 7 in our next recorded lecture.